You're listening to the Professional Adjunct Podcast, episode PA014. Hello, friends. You're listening to the Professional Adjunct Podcast, brought to you by Faculty Focus. Here we share ideas about teaching students in the classroom, online, and blended learning environments. On this show, we will discuss strategies for teaching with the purpose of becoming more effective at what we do. Let's get started. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Professional Adjunct Podcast. I'm here with Beth.
Hello.
And today we're going to discuss an article that was published in Faculty Focus on February 2nd, 2015, 10 Tips for More Efficient and Effective Grading, written by Dr. Victoria Smith and Stephanie Maher Palenque. And Beth is the one that brought this to my attention because, as we were talking earlier, grading is an ongoing concern for instructors, and particularly so for those instructors that are teaching in an accelerated format.
Yes, because not only is it accelerated for the students, but that grading piece, getting those assignments back to them so it's timely before the next assignment, that's accelerated for the instructors as well.
Absolutely. In fact, you have had the experience of teaching a 15-week class that seemed to be crammed into 8 weeks.
Yes. So there can be almost a cognitive overload if you've got too many assignments in there to grade. So that, from an instructional design, we need to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe we'll talk about that in another podcast down the road, because I think that is an important thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's only so much you can learn in a 5, 6, or 8 week class.
Right.
And we don't want to cut our students short. But back to the topic of this article, it does put some pressure on the instructor to get the grading done and comments and feedback back to the student in a timely manner so that it can be applied to their next assignment.
And there's only so much feedback they can absorb in that accelerated time frame as well.
That's interesting, too.
And we'll get to that point here as we go through all these 10 tips.
All right. Well, let's start with the first one. One and done. In the article, it says, mention the error and explain how to correct it once. And the way I interpret that is a lot of times students will have repeated mistakes in the same paper. For instance, in the article uses the example of writing in the second person. And so the first time the mistake is pointed out, highlighted, comments are made, and so on and so forth, is to bring attention to it and show them how to correct it if possible. But then when it's repeated in the same assignment again, you don't necessarily have to go into as much detail. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. And since I teach English, if they make an error in like grammar or punctuation, they tend to repeat it through the paper. So if I'm giving them a ton of feedback on each instance, not only does their paper look a little overwhelming with all those little boxes, but they just feel overwhelmed. So for instance, comma usage is a common error. So they could have 10 to 15 comma errors in there. So the first one, I might explain what they did wrong and maybe a resource where they can go back and get some more information on that. But the next one is just comma error.
Yeah.
Short and sweet.
See note above.
Right.
Otherwise, as you said, the paper gets, it appears to be, the feedback gets to be overwhelming.
It does.
Or as an instructor used to tell me, your paper is bleeding with corrections because it was written up in red ink.
And if they just look at that, it's a lot to absorb. And some students stop right there. They look at the grade and they go on.
And they feel defeated.
They do.
Rather than
degraded.
Yeah, degraded. Nice. Nice. No pun intended, of
no
course.
Pun intended.
Right? Very good. The next point is bank comments. Keep a bank of comments about frequent errors students make and organize them in groups for easy access. Now, I know both of us do that.
Right. I've done it two different ways. I've done a Word document that's laid out similar to my rubric, and I've also done it as an Excel spreadsheet. I tend to like the Word document a little better. It's easier to cut and paste.
Yeah, I do too.
But I know that you have also used one where it will automatically insert comments based on a command that you give.
There's a TextEdit application that does that.
Right.
TextEdit or some. I'll have to post a link to it because then you can create shortcuts
Right.
for commonly used phrases. So for grading, it was great. I found it to be a little bit cumbersome and just easier to have a Word document with the common phrases because I always end up editing or, personalizing them to the situation. So like you, I use a Microsoft Word document for the most part. I have a bank of comments that apply to papers and then another one that applies to discussions.
Right.
And that does save me a lot of time, for just simple phrases like you need support from our textbook.
And if I lay them out kind of like I have the rubric, there's different criteria in the rubric. If I have it divided by that, say participation or critical thinking or mechanics. That's
a good idea.
Then it's easy to pull a phrase out of this one and really customize it.
I like that. For those of you that don't know, Beth and I are married, and we both have been teaching online classes for many years now. But you wouldn't know that we work in the same house sometimes because we do things differently. Which is part of the fun of doing these podcasts with you because you'll bring up things that I didn't know you did. Hey, that's a good idea. Well, how come I'm not doing it? Why haven't you told me about that?
I have my secret stash here.
Yeah, I guess so. You're trying to keep one up on me, I think. So that's good. But so a bank of comments does help to maintain consistency.
That is important, yes. So you're consistent and fair between all the different papers that you're grading. And that's another reason why I like to grade papers close together. So I'll do all my prep work and I will grade those papers in it one day, perhaps.
In one setting kind of thing?
In one setting, so that my comments stay consistent.
Yeah.
And I'm interpreting the rubric consistently for all the students.
I recommend that to faculty that I coach as well.
Because we can have a bad day or
right.
we can feel a little tired or maybe we're getting a cold and it affects us.
Yep. Or just the opposite. One day you're just feeling a little more generous. And then the next day you and I had a squabble or something and I want to take it out on a student. That's true. It never does happen.
That never happens. But if it did.
But so maintaining consistency in grading, part of doing that is grading like assignments in one setting. Of course, taking a break when you need it.
Right.
But yeah, not dragging it out over several days. I think there's a lot to that.
Mm-hmm. And having that feedback bank there helps you go through faster so you can get it done in one setting.
Absolutely. We talked about that when it comes to grading discussions too.
Mm-hmm.
When you participate in the discussion, it's much easier to grade it because you've already read most of everything that's been posted.
Right.
And it's just a matter of evaluating it for a grade. Okay, the third point is front load feedback. Can you talk about that?
Well, that's where I maybe put an announcement and I clarify the rubric so students know what I'm looking for. So if it's looking at participation, then I'm very open and honest. I'm looking for you to post by the third day. I'd like to see your responses to other peer initial posts by, say, Friday, and then replies back. So it gives them a clear guidance on what that rubric actually means to me, because different instructors can interpret the same rubric in different ways.
No doubt. Now, in the article, they're talking more specifically about grading a first draft and then when they submit a final draft. And I know, you teach English composition.
Right.
So do you give more thorough feedback in the draft phase of a paper than you would on the final phase?
Definitely, I do. I go through that draft with a fine-tooth comb as much as possible to point out mechanical errors that they're consistently missing, or if they have some organizational issues and some suggestions on how to reduce wordiness, for example. If they're not getting a concept clearly, then I might inject some questions for them to think about and expand their paper and maybe get them back on track to what they need to do for an effective argument, things like that. So in the draft, I will do that. And then in the final paper, it's a matter of just a few comments and pulling it together for them, but I don't give them the intensive feedback that I do for the draft.
We were talking earlier about the accelerated format.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it more productive for a student in an accelerated formatted class, let's say 6 or 8 weeks, to submit a draft 1 week and then a final draft the next week? Or do you think it could be done effectively by submitting both the draft as well as the final paper in the same week?
Both in the same week. For the student, it's not as effective because I can't give them feedback.
So you're saying that trying to do both in the same week is not a good idea?
No. What I see a lot of courses designed with is they have a discussion that acts like a draft so they can post their thoughts there as they're working on a paper. And that's where we can give them some feedback in the discussion on their thinking process, how they're putting things together, maybe some more resources they should check, or whether their resources are, in fact, scholarly.
And then the next week they write a paper.
It can be done two ways. The discussion that I was talking about was almost like a peer review discussion,
right?
Where they're working out their ideas in the discussion, and they turn in a final paper at the end of that week.
I see. The hang up then is getting a draft submitted and back to the student with feedback before they have to write the final draft.
That is the issue.
That is the issue. So if it's done in a discussion format with peer review, and of course you'd be commenting in there as well, then they're getting comments on what could be considered their draft so that they can apply it to their final paper that's submitted at the end of that week.
Right. So they're getting some forward feedback in that way.
That makes sense. Boy, you've taught some classes where they try to do a draft and the final copy in the same week, and it's tough.
It's hard for students to grasp when they're learning about the writing. Now, if in another class that's more topical focused, like some of those that you teach, then it's a little bit different scenario.
Yeah, but still it's a challenge for me to get comments back to them in a timely manner so that they can apply it to the paper that's due at the end of the week.
Right.
So there are pros and cons to accelerated format for sure.
There is.
The fourth point in this paper is global comments versus local corrections. And the authors say if a student has written the paper in the incorrect genre in his or her first draft, comment minimally on local level issues such as grammar and format, and instead focus comments on the global issues. For example, if the student writes a summary of a work and the assignment asks for an analysis instead, then it is best to comment globally. If the student needs to rewrite the entire essay, it is fruitless to provide copious commentary regarding grammar and mechanics.
That is true. So if the whole premise of their paper is off, it doesn't do any good to tell them that they keep misspelling or misusing there and there.
Because they have to rewrite it anyway.
That's true.
Okay. I think we've all used the term or the acronym KISS, keep it simple for students. When making grading a teachable moment, be sure comments do not become so convoluted and esoteric so as to impair learning. Keep the language academic yet accessible to the student.
It needs to be clear and concise.
Yeah.
No pontificating here.
Oh, shoot. You know how much I love to pontificate.
I know. And as academics, we like to be impressive. We like to use big words.
But in the case of grading papers, we do have to take that into consideration.
Right. It's better to be understood than to impress.
There you go. Good way to put it. Hey, everybody. Just want to take a quick break from our podcast to tell you about the upcoming Teaching Professor Technology Conference, which begins on September 30th in Atlanta, Georgia. At this conference, we will examine the technologies that are changing the way teachers teach and students learn while giving special emphasis to the pedagogically effective ways you can harness these new technologies in your courses and on your campus. The 3-day conference brings together approximately 650 faculty, instructional designers, faculty developers, educational technology leaders, and other higher education professionals interested in learning more about how technology is altering the learning environment. Now in its 4th year, the Teaching Professor Technology Conference also features 4 pre-conference workshops, more than 65 concurrent sessions, and dozens of poster presentations, all in a collegial and collaborative setting. Beth and I will be at the conference recording interviews with some of the presenters for our podcast. We'd love for you to stop by and say hello. So won't you join us, along with Faculty Focus, at the Teaching Professor Technology Conference, September 30th through October 2nd in Atlanta, Georgia. For more information, visit www.teachingprofessortechnologyconference.com. And now, back to our episode. Attitude and approach make student learning the primary goal. Effective feedback is a mutual process involving both student and instructor. The student's involvement in learning is at least partially dependent on their perception of their instructor's interest and friendliness, as well as their instructor's engagement and communication about their performance and their grades.
There again is a good example. I tend to be very direct, and I had to soften that a bit because some students misinterpreted that as being almost cruel to them. In a way, I was too direct.
You're mean.
I'm mean, but that was not my intention. So I had to learn to soften that a lot so that they felt that I did care. There's an old saying that it doesn't matter how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right. That applies to teaching more than probably anything else.
It's kind of that social presence in your grading.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not out to fail students.
No.
We're out there to help them learn and improve.
One thing that you've got to always keep in mind as you're going through the grades too is that you might have gone through 10 papers and corrected the same mistake, but for that student, that is their only mistake. So you've got to address it not as a repeat offender, but as an individual, that this is their first chance to get corrected on that.
That is part of human nature, though.
It is.
So that's something we have to be aware of.
Exactly.
This might be the 14th time that I've made the same comment and correction, but it's the first time for this particular student.
Right. So we've got to keep that caring attitude present.
So we don't use all caps.
No.
As I said the previous 15 times.
Well, this is one area where a lot of students are used to using texties and the emoticons. And so to add an emotional element to connect with the students, sometimes I will put an emoticon in with my grading.
Yeah, I've done that a little bit.
Very limited, yes.
Just like, I'm trying to think of a good example of just a comment of how they could have maybe written it a little bit better with a little emoticon saying, I'm here to help kind of thing.
You have a saying, too, that you like to put at the end of a lot of comments.
I hope that helps.
Yes, and that helps soften it, too, so that they know that you're there to help.
Yeah, I just started using that in the last few months, and I find that it does do that. It softens my comments. So when a student posts a question in the student lounge, I will give them the answer or correct a student that may have given an answer or clarify or something. But yeah, at the end of it, I put, I hope that helps.
Right.
And therefore, it kind of softens. I'm not trying to be critical or overly corrective, but here's how I would do it. I hope that helps. And it does soften it a little bit.
It does.
I think the reception is a little better.
Mm-hmm.
Conscious use of comments. Did I already do that one? No, I didn't.
That's the next one.
Effective feedback is applicable to future situations. Comment only when there is still something the student can do to improve the grade on a live assignment, unless they can use the comment on a final product to enhance learning and the quality of subsequent assignments.
So how I phrase that in my grading feedback is I will start off with keep working on, and then I may say organizing your paragraphs or reducing, simplifying your sentences, or not using as much passive, or using more active. I try to keep it in the positive. So keep working on this and expanding what is working well. And if they have an issue that they're consistently missing, then I will try to phrase it in a positive way that this is how it would look better on future papers.
One of the things that I do in my overall comments, I've added the phrase, here are some things for you to consider as you write your next paper.
And that both softens it and gives them something to work on.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I was just going to say, and it also helps the student to realize that I am trying to give them some pointers to improve on their next paper.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next point is avoid surprises. Publish or distribute rubrics well in advance of assignments due dates so that students know how their papers will be evaluated. We've pretty much already covered that earlier.
Right. And some learning management systems let you connect assignments to a rubric, and others may have it as a separate item. But one way or another, those students need to be able to see that rubric well in advance before they actually do the assignment.
I sometimes think instructors are surprised to know that. I mean, I have taught new instructors teaching online, instructors preparing them to teach their first class online. And I've actually been asked that question, well, should we show them the rubric before the assignment? Yes, you should, because it's only fair that they know how they're going to be graded. And the same goes for students. I think a lot of students don't realize that rubric is there and that it's a tool for them to use to evaluate their own work before they submit it.
And I point them to that in my introductory welcome. I will make sure and mention, be sure you check out the rubrics, or perhaps in the assignment instructions, I will say, please see the rubric.
Yeah, and the rubric's always there.
Right.
But they don't always click on it.
Right.
So you point it out to make it obvious. I have tips for new and returning students, since
Right.
a lot of our students are returning to college after a long absence. And one of the things that I cover is writing. And that's one of the points I make on there. Review your assignment before you turn it in. Evaluate it. Did you meet all of the different areas of the rubric?
Mm-hmm. And I liken it to, if you're in an NC class, your students are going to ask you that. In an online class, they may just assume that they know
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because they don't have that physical face-to-face contact and think, I need to ask this question. I have had in the past where students didn't look at the rubric and they say, well, my last teacher did it this way. And I have to apologize and say, I don't know what that teacher did, but this is what I expect. And please refer back to the expectations.
Yeah.
That's especially why I've started putting in an announcement, fleshing out that rubric.
I get those emails all the time. When I've marked up a paper pretty good for improper APA or MLA,
Mm-hmm.
then I get the email. Well, I've had 6 classes and nobody's ever downgraded me on APA style.
Right.
And all I can do is say, well, I can't speak for your previous instructors, but this is the standard.
Right.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
And this is how you prevent that anxiety.
Yeah.
Because, like it or not, if the student feels that they've been wronged in some way, no matter how much explaining you do after the fact, they may say something on the evaluation.
Yeah, sure.
So that all plays into it.
Should we talk about that, or is that another topic?
That's another topic.
I think the evaluation is another topic we should discuss sometime.
Mm-hmm.
Point number 9. Did you have something else?
No, I was just going to say grading the instructor. That's another topic.
Yeah, we should do that. Less is more. Instructors should avoid the temptation to respond to everything that calls for adjustments or changes. Many struggling students need to focus on just a few areas or even one item at a time. If a student backs off from his or her paper because he or she is intimidated by the number of instructor comments, then all is lost. It is better to target 2 or 3 areas that need to be addressed for the student's success on future papers.
That's something I had to learn the hard way because I wanted to help students with everything. And I get students at various levels of writing skills. And so I was trying to bring the very simplistic papers up to a higher level. And sometimes I would overwhelm them with all the work on this, work on this, work on this. And there was just too much for them to do.
Yeah.
So they would freeze.
I guess that's what I mean by my, when I said I try to help a student take their paper from one level of writing to the next.
Right.
Based on their first paper that I see, that kind of sets the gauge for me.
Right.
And I can't always remember, okay, this is the student that struggles in this area. But usually based on their papers, I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. Then I'm working on general mechanics or something like that, paragraph structure or something along those lines, where I'll have other students that write very well, but they use an announcement in their introduction rather than a thesis statement. And so I'll point that out.
Right. You take each student from where they are and take them just to their next level, not your high standard.
Yet that brings up a concern maybe, or a question I'm sure some of our audience is asking themselves, would both of those students receive the same grade?
No, they would not. And that's where I sometimes make more global comments. And I also have an automated mechanics report that does give them all of that as a separate tool. And then on their paper itself, I can focus on the more global issues, on how they're organizing and structuring their paper and the ideas of it. So they almost get two sets of feedback. One is the local mechanics and more of the presentation APA style, and then it's the structure and organization of the paper.
But the bottom line is they're all graded on the same scale with the same rubric.
Right.
It's just where you choose to emphasize your comments.
Right.
That makes a difference.
Right. So they aren't overwhelmed, and they can take the steps and see their grade improving.
Right. I like that. The 10th and final point brought up in this article is questions for reflection. Consider inviting reflective, critical thinking and further conversation in a productive scholarly exchange with the student. Instead of telling students what they did wrong, ask them to rethink their approach. For example, consider using a phrase such as, "What is the most interesting aspect of your essay?" Doing it this way, the student is not only prompted to make more thoughtful revisions, but also is given tools to use when considering how to write a hook for future essays.
That ties in very much with the conscious use of comments and the feedback that's applicable to future situations. So if they're struggling with some critical thinking or cause and effect or comparison or analysis types issues, that's where these questions can help them in future papers.
Yes, or in drafts.
Right.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind, and I just recently went through a series of papers late last week grading, and the thing that seemed to be missing from most of them was just a good thesis.
Right.
And if you don't have a good thesis, your paper is just kind of floundering. I mean, it may have good logical sequence to it and everything else, but there's no point to it.
Right.
So I keep, I made comment after comment after comment, rather than announcing what you're going to write about, come up with a good thesis statement that tells me what it is you're trying to prove in your paper.
Right.
And then in my general comments to the class, I made that comment that a thesis is part of the rubric, plus it's an important piece of writing a good academic paper.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a direction.
And that has to be, I think, it's almost the hinge that if in that first introductory paragraph, if I'm not seeing that, then that just kind of sets the tone for the whole paper.
Now, this article, there's a conclusion here. Douglas B. Reeves, author and educator, said, "Technology sometimes encourages people to confuse busyness with effectiveness. Instructors sometimes equate certain grading practices such as an authoritative tone, strong criticism, or copious comments with being effective. In fact, the more conscious and deliberate an instructor is when delivering feedback, the better that feedback tends to be. Instructors often feel as though they must sacrifice effectiveness for efficiency or efficiency for effectiveness. By honoring these guiding principles, instructors will realize that they do not need to make a choice between the two."
That whole thing is tied up by the fact that differences in curriculum have little, if any, effect on student outcomes. It's the feedback that makes a difference.
Yeah, sure. The feedback is what students are going to apply to their next assignments. I think what the authors are trying to say from this quote by Douglas B. Reeves is that it's not necessarily important that you bring to the attention every mistake that the student made, but that you use grading comments that will help the student to improve.
Right. It's kind of a measure of grace with grading.
Yeah, instructors often feel as though they must sacrifice effectiveness for efficiency or efficiency for effectiveness. But sometimes I think we try to be overly effective by pointing out every little mistake.
There is a thing about being too helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it goes back to the point we talked about early in overwhelming the student.
Right.
Where it gets to be discouraging, degrading, and the whole thing. And students need to accept feedback, but it needs to be given with the right attitude up front.
Mm-hmm. I think they tend to read the feedback more if you are a little judicious about the different, the amount of feedback that you give and the attitude that you write it in.
And I think another important part, too, is that we need to, not ignore the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a stickler about APA style, as you know, but I have to consciously go back and look for the content too.
Right.
Did the student address the prompts in the assignment? Did they do so effectively? Did they support it with good evidence? In other words, did they use their critical thinking skills and analyze it? Or is it just that it's a good, well-written paper, but it never quite got there, you know?
Right.
And it's easy to grade a paper for mechanics and style, but we cannot ignore the substance of the paper either.
And I use Grammarly.com to preview those mechanical errors so that I can get that part of it done quickly and really focus on the content and the ideas that the student's conveying.
Okay, so as a way of wrapping up this discussion, let's talk about that just for the last couple of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
The actual process of grading a paper.
Right.
So the way I do it, you know, of course, most of my classes are done in Blackboard. So I stopped downloading papers a long time ago, and I mark them and grade them right there in Blackboard, which I think is just great.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing I do is I look at the paper for presentation. Is their header there? Is their cover page proper? Are the titles there? Is it paragraphed and spaced properly? Is the reference page set up properly and stuff like that? So I do a quick cursory glance at that and make comments as I go through that. And then I go back and read the paper for the content.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I do it as well. Although I do download it, I've gotten into that practice because now I can't grade within the learning management system in all the different ones that I use. So I download it so I can make comments that way. It's just easier for me. And that way I can also upload it into Grammarly and do that real quick mechanical check as well.
And then do you send them a PDF copy of that Grammarly report?
I do. I download that Grammarly report. And of course, I will look at it, and there's certain things that it will catch that are not that big of a deal.
Right.
So, and depending on what style and genre of writing,
right,
you can pick that as well.
Can you edit those comments? Or
I can edit what it catches.
Oh, sure.
I cannot edit necessarily the comments it gives.
Right.
But I can add to that if I need to.
So then you use the review function in Microsoft Word to track changes. In other words, you're writing your comments in little bubbles and things like that.
Yes. And I know that sometimes if in Microsoft Word, if I use the outline feature to kind of check how they're structured, then it helps me in that way because it'll tag different things and I'll be able to see that the flow of their ideas is smooth because it'll put it in more of an outline rather than paragraph form.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Cool. And then it's just a matter of uploading it back into the learning management system and then providing general comments overall. I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking, in Blackboard, the rubric is built into the gradebook so that I can mark the rubric right then and there. And then I make general comments for the student to consider, always referring them to the paper for specifics.
And if I have a learning management system that doesn't directly connect the rubric with the assignment, so I can't just go in and check mark, I will actually upload, give them their own rubric with highlighted parts of it.
So there are situations where you're actually sending the student 3 different documents.
Yes, but it's separated out so it's a little more digestible for them. They see the rubric itself.
Right.
Which is the same as if it was connected and I check marked the boxes.
And that gives them the overall grade and where they did well and didn't.
Right. And I do the mechanics separate because that's one of those local, there's tools to help you with this. Use them. And I show that if they didn't use them, these are all the errors that could have been caught.
Okay, good. Well, I think that pretty much covers this article. If you have any comments about any of the things that we have said in relation to this article, feel free to post them as a comment in our blog, or you can send them in an email as well to comments@proadjunct.com. Otherwise,
we have some grading to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we do, don't we? All right. So with that, we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Professional Adjunct Podcast. Please visit our website at www.professionaladjunct.com. There you can subscribe to our podcast and share your comments, questions, and ideas. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, too.
See you next week.